And now we will, I'll stop sharing and we'll go on to our speaker. Let me introduce Margaret Tullis, who will introduce Al Canner.
Hi, y'all. Al Canner is retired from teaching at CU's Law School and other professional legal pursuits. But we in the fiber community and textile community are the beneficiaries of all of this. And all those folks who enjoy his work are right there with us. He has stayed at the law school in a way. You can see his works, and Nicole gets to see them every day. Oh, every day that she goes to work, I hope you get to stay home some. And then there's this thing called Convergence, and I think Al will be telling you a bit about his piece that got into that this year, which is pretty darn cool. So indulge me a bit here, Al. There are a couple of us here in the group who are applauding the double half hitch because, and right, Joanne, I hope you're here. She's taking over Nicole's job. We're tatters, and the double half hitch or the lark's head is the mainstay of our work too. Also attributed to sailors, also related to macramé. And when I went to Peru for Chinqui, I actually bought what I now know are cabandoli bracelets, because I guess the sailors got them there too. And the Tiwanaku hats that we really got to study, when we got in there and really looked at what we were looking at, double half hitches there too. So we kind of have a theory that maybe they got shrunk as felt, and that's how they got to be so close together. Might try that with some wool cord, right? Anyway, ply splitters out there, beware. New pathways could occur here. And anyone interested in color and composition, you need to take note as well. Okay, so tonight Al is going to tell us about knots and bolts. I know the chat room yesterday reflected a lot of technical curiosity, and hopefully your quest just starts here. Please welcome Al Canner.
Well, thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction, and I'm really happy to be back again. I must say, ever since I finished on Monday, I've been looking forward to this evening to go on and say more about it. So I'm very honored and humbled to be here. And as I said yesterday, I really recognize that I'm speaking as really sort of an untrained novice person in many ways to people who are very accomplished. And I really respect that and appreciate your asking me to do this. So just for those who are joining for the first time tonight, which perhaps is the majority, I just want to spend a moment or two placing macramé in history. And as was suggested, it's been around for a long time, really as far back as we have any evidence in statuary, for example, from the Babylonian and Assyrians. There was decorative knot tying, and there's all sorts of textile evidence from the 3rd century China. But mostly it's thought of as having its origins, macramé as we think of it now, in the Arabic world in 13th century. And then the Moors brought it to Spain and all throughout Europe. And as it's been suggested, it was a huge time consumer for sailors in the earlier times and in the 18th and 19th century and more modern times. And then had a huge, macramé did, a huge boom during the Victorian era, when I've read things that said it was almost in every single, I guess, British, they were talking about, home at the time in one way or another. And then, as many of us experienced in the 1970s, at least in the Western world, it had a big heyday again, mostly with plant hangers and loads of 2-dimensional or slightly 3-dimensional owls on the wall. And that's when I started doing plant hangers. And as I explained at great length yesterday, it went from there. So yesterday was really about the what. What is it that I'm producing? What are these works? And today I'd like to get much more into the how. So hopefully this will work, and I will share my screen. Okay, it worked. It's always a great relief when you get past this first moment. So there's, in not so much depth, of course, as I'd like, but we're going to touch upon at least these things tonight. The humble double half hitch, just as a basic understanding of this, mounting and ending of pieces. And I must say, just as an aside here, I've always thought that the most difficult parts in reverse order are the mounting and the ending. And even though, as I was answering yesterday a question about my creative process, I rarely actually draw things out. I do have a pretty strong mental vision about it, but sometimes I really go into the piece only knowing the mounting and ending. I always force myself at least to do that because I know that particularly for endings, unless I start setting up my piece for it, sometimes almost from the very beginning, I won't achieve the ending that I might have in mind. And then we're going to talk about adding new chord in both the weft and in the warp, and then weft and warp switching, and the effect of concave convex curves, intermingling of chord gauge size, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, in my case particularly, and then a whole bunch of aspects about three-dimensional sculptural forms, bulges from increased chord density and some other ways, rising into space, as I call it, the rule of the straw of the pipe, and then the whole expanding, contracting world that is what makes up orbs. So compared to those of you, I mean, look behind Nicole. Is that real life behind you, Nicole, or is that just a thing?
It is not real life.
Oh, okay. I mean, you cannot walk around with that item behind Nicole,
No.
but you can, in my case, with macrame. And if I'm doing a small piece, I'm able to take everything I need with me when I go camping. And at the end of the hiking each day, I'm able to break it out and spend some time, though many times my boards are too big for that. But what you need is cord. Mostly these days, for myself, I get it online, and there's all sorts of sources, and you can find great buys. And sometimes these businesses go out of business, and you can really buy a lot of stuff at a great price and so on. I find for myself having a great diversity of cord really pumps my inspiration. Sometimes when I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, I just get out on the floor, sometimes all of my cord, and regroup it by color and this and that. And sometimes, boy, does that do it. Then a cork board. I found over time that I need a 1-inch thick cork board, because otherwise I push my pins in too hard and I end up going into my leg or in my hand. So 1 inch is good. They're much more available in 1/2-inch size, and I found you can just buy 2 and use really strong clips that you get at the office supply store, and you end up with a 1-inch one. And you can get them online in a whole variety of sizes now. My biggest that I use is 24 inches by 36 inches. And I often work on a 20 by 20 inch board. And it shows in my work. Loads of my pieces are 19 inches by 19 inches or 23 inches by 35 inches because of fitting on the board. And then T-pins, which I bet you all know what those are. They're literally shaped like a T. You can get them all over the place. And they're wonderful. And I use them all the time, both for their sort of intended purpose, but also as a tool. If I have to do the horrible thing of untying, it's usually the T-pin that allows me access into the cord again to do that. And I have a small scissors, and it's the type, I should know the name of this, but I forget, that has the spring in it. So you're not actually having to pump open, but it reacts, and much otherwise you die with all the cutting you end up doing with the scissors. I use rubber bands quite a bit, usually just to deal with the smaller loose ends when I'm cutting things off at the end, and more for storage after that. I use all the time an incredibly useful tool, a small needle nose pliers, and it also has whatever it's called with that spring resistant thing. And it's so useful. But really the scissors and the pliers, those are the two tools. And then, boy, have I found you must have finger, particularly maybe slash hand, but it's the fingertips mostly. And then the joints where when you're pulling that the cord actually hits against. So what I have finally found after years and years of trying all sorts of different types of gloves of every imaginable fabric and so on, but they never would work. They would get holes in no time. And if they had any sort of even microscopic fiber extending, it gets caught in the knot and it's just, a disaster. But what now I use, and I often have like 3 on one hand and 2 on another, not always the same fingers, depending on what piece I'm working on. I use those rubber fingertips that secretaries used to use to flip through paper quickly. And I have them in a whole bunch of different sizes. And I often cut off the very tip of it so I can slide it down where I know I'm going to have the cord hitting all the time. So I often go through a whole set of whatever number I'm using, about 5 usually, per piece, and sometimes have to change it more depending on how rough the cord is. And then, of course, you all will be familiar with these absolute mandates of good lighting and seating. And I could only do my work, I know, as I always have, with an extension arm sort of lamp that I can really get in, right to the knots I'm working on, and it changes direction in all sorts of ways. And then sadly, and finally, the name of a great PT who's a certified hand therapist. I wish I could just laugh when I say this, but as many of you probably know from the various ways you're using your hands, boy, can this be brutal. I retired, as I mentioned yesterday, 9 years ago from the professional pursuits, and have for 8 years, until about a year ago, was macrameing about 6 hours a day, almost always 6 days a week. And boy, was I lucky. I look back on it now in the last year with all the breakdown that's happened in my tendons and my fingers and arthritis and on and on and on. And now I have to sort of dole out when I can work during the day. Okay, well, here it is, the double half hitch. So the top part here, I just recently clipped out of a web page. You can make out the name of it there, but if you Google half hitch or double half hitch, you'll find, this. I thought this was a particularly clear example, but this is my verbiage for it. And so this, you start from the back, let's say this piece right here, and you bring the weft from the rear and then forward under the wrap, under the warp, and raise the weft in front of and over the warp, and then back behind and through the loop. So it's just a behind, and then you pull it very tight. And I just want to note, I don't know if they did this thinking of this, but it's not just inconsequential the way they have this sort of perpendicular look of both these chords. What I found over time, and I'm sort of noted for the incredible uniformity of my knotting, if you don't on every knot pay attention like this and sort of seat yourself, I've learned, right in front of the knot I'm working on, and really do it tight and straight. And boy, do you have to hold on to this one, keeping it tight while you do this one. It's just something over time that you get good at. And I bet you all will if you do, because this is it. This is the double half hitch, which I do over and over and over and over and over, and sort of love. Often, depending on the chord you're using, but it's very often, when you do this second knot, I don't know whether it's something I hear. I suspect more it's in my fingers and then through my body. You hear the knot locking in. You feel it happen. And if I don't, I know I haven't pulled hard enough. And then I pull again and it slips in. So it's that sort of intent. Though I find I can be thinking of all sorts of things and not just what I'm working on, but you do really have to stay tuned in there. So now let's talk about some, just get rolling mounting techniques. I stumbled upon everything I know, because I am completely self-taught. I didn't even know at the beginning what this was called. I just knew, starting out with something like this, and I knew, well, I have to do something, and sort of did this. And many of you, I'm sure, know this very simple knot. It's the name I most use myself in here is the lark's head, but it's also commonly called the cow hitch, and all these thousands of other knot names, and I bet it even has more. So a very obvious, fine, and outspoken, not hiding anything way to start is with the lark's head lined up, and with a little bit of experience, you'll get a sense of how far to put them. It actually, depending on the chord you're working on, it seems not to be an arithmetic formula because it seems to fluctuate quite a bit more than the math would suggest to me based on the size of the chord. But after a few knots, you get a sense of how much to space them out. So from a straight rod, and I'm going to show you some examples of these in my work next, you don't have to actually use a rod of some sort. You can actually just use cord. You can, pin it down and pull it taut and use that as if it were the rod or any other appropriate object or inappropriate. So this piece of mine, crenellation, is a very sort of quiet piece for me, both color-wise and otherwise. But I wanted to show you just along the top here that's just sort of a classic. It could have been a rod, but in fact, it was, tightly pulled cord. And then I've learned over time, what to do at the ends of those cords to integrate them into the work. And this is another example, but with a more complex design application. Each of these areas right here, these horizontal lines, were all start points for me. And I did just this very simple lark's head and started down. And then when I hit here, I revised it so I could then start going straight across and then incorporated the others. But so the reason I'm taking the moments to say this is I want to really encourage you, if you're interested in trying to dive into this, you can sort of very quickly do something relatively sophisticated that is really just relying upon the same very elementary skill over and over. So here's a mounting technique, again, using the lark's head, but from a T-pinned form. And this has been something I've done a lot of since years ago. I discovered it, because I didn't know it from anywhere else. And what I do in pieces like this is I actually mount onto my cork board using loads of T-pins, because I'm doing it on a cord itself. And like every 3 inches or 2 inches. And of course, every time there's a turn, you end up with a pin here and a pin here and a pin here. And, so I don't know, 100 or 150, I don't know how many pins it ends up being. And it's just the cord upon which I then spend, in a piece this size, a couple of days of 6-hour days when I was doing that, just mounting with the lark's head. But then when you've done that, and then you start going around the entire thing with a course. And every time you go around, if you're going in and not just rising from the wall, gets smaller and smaller until you finish at one point, as I'll be showing you. And these are just a smattering of examples. I call these mostly my pods. This is called Hexapod and Octopod. These don't have pod names, but I think of them that way. And these are all examples of just usually on my 20-inch by 20-inch board, just sort of laying down a chord. And as I'll talk about in a few moments, the benefits of having these sorts of amazing curves, which end up being so luscious as you build on it and make your form. So this idea of making any shape you want, and over time you'll learn certain shapes that you don't want just because of the hard things that you get yourself into. But you can really do a lot of any shape. And then here's a mounting technique that I came across, and I don't know, I'm sure I'm not the first person who ever did this by any means, but I myself discovered it sort of deeper into the game. And in this piece called Pyramid, which is on the wall there behind me, this is all double lark's head mounted, with the second one being directed in the opposite direction. So it allows me from, for example, oh, I can give you a better picture here. Yeah. For right here, for example, the white serves as my warp on this basic pattern. And I have two of them here. And I've shot off, and you can't see the other, well, they're all green. I always did this on each one of these. All the abutting colors are the same in every case. And but underneath this is another one heading off that way. So I won't try to get, have you really understand it, but just the idea that you can actually mount the lark's heads in such a way that you can go in both directions from the same vertebra, if you will. And that really has been a great thing for me. I've incorporated that in a bunch of pieces, and perhaps most notably for me, this piece called Start Stops of just a couple of years ago. And in this close-up, you can see this is just use here of this form, this double lark's head with different colors. So you can almost see right beneath the light color, there's the red one going off in the other direction. And in this piece, this was more for me as the maker probably than for the viewer, because I know how complicated this piece was and how hard it was to have so many start points. I just mounted and started in all different directions, and then of course had to likewise end all those starts. So it was for me sort of a piece of accomplishment. And then a very frequent and easy sort of way to get rolling is with just what I refer to as a spiral starting point. So this piece began right here. I think I have a close up of that. Yeah. And the way to do this actually is just with a taut piece of cord as your warp, do 3 lark's heads. And then before you do the 4th, in a clumsy way, remove at least one of the pins and bring it around so that your 4th knot actually ends up now being a second course as you start coiling around and around. But to keep it in any sort of flatness, this has a bit of bulge here, you have to be adding cord constant. Otherwise, you'd end up with a straw. But if you want it to flatten out, and at the beginning, you're adding a cord almost after every single knot to keep it flat-ish. In my 10 yarmulkes piece, one of my faves, all 10 of the yarmulkes are this point start, as this one indicates. Started right here after 3 knots, I forced the 4th around, so the 4th knot connected, and then just went around and around and around. And this one, I didn't really, on this piece, I didn't really have to worry so much about the ending. And what I did around the end was just a double row in all of them of waxed linen, about 0.7 millimeter waxed linen. And when you tie a knot out of that, it does not come out ever again. And it stops everything else from possibly, fraying and coming out. So another technique, which I've used very seldom, but this is a piece that's up at the law school, part of my public land suite, is just sort of the idea of tacking the ends, beginnings and the ends, behind something. And I did it in this piece all around with upholstery tacks, which are much longer thumbtack, spears than the normal ones. And it went into the wood and luckily held it. And it allowed me in the starts and stops to be as, sort of messy and ugly and, knowing that it would never show. But I haven't used this technique much myself. So now I want to look at some ending techniques. And as I mentioned to you, I think endings are perhaps, for many pieces I look at anyway, maybe I'm too strong on this, but it tells me how sophisticated the maker is. most of the sort of hanging down at the end pieces, which are like a lot of the owls and early pieces you see, and still a lot of the sort of currently made traditional big pieces of open air macrame, they end in that. And it's an obvious and simple way. And I never do it anymore since my earliest days, because I feel, for me, it feels like a cop-out way. But I wanted to show you this woman's work, because here we have a piece with a hanging down end that is magnificent. This wonderful woman, Diane Itter, had, as you can see, a really short life, but she did a lot of work like this in Cavendoli macrame, the particular type of continuous use of double half-hitch, resulting in a very tight weave, if you will, with a warp and a weft. And she really took it places. But all her work, if you look her up online, you'll find loads of her work. Much of it is like this, this almost over and over, this repeated gorgeous shape and the hanging down and geometric forms that are made by switching back and forth ever so skillfully from warp and weft. So I think she can do it. Her pieces can end with hang down because she has mastered that. And then something that, again, I created, but I'm sure others, millions of others have done. But for me, it was a big discovery. And you can see just a little bit of it here at the corner. So when I was coming down here at the end, the last piece coming down as weft became a new warp. And I used the lark's head all down here and headed in this way and did the same thing from the other end. And so these new pieces of weft, which could be a different color like I chose here, are doing their own thing, going up and down, up and down here you can see it here going up and then turning here and coming down while I'm nodding, and then it goes here and the weft is heading that direction. But the way this works is every time and holds this border on and ends it is when I get up here. I'll look over here where it might be easier to see. When I get up here and then I'm starting knotting down, at this knot, I grab a piece of the dark brown weft that was coming down here and was just all, oop, that was a mistake. All just loose weft here behind this. I take one every time I go down and use it as like a back double warp. I keep it in the back, right behind the warp I'm using, but I end up tying 2 or 3 knots with this other piece of warp, which is one of these wefts. And then I dismiss it. I push it out for the next knot, and then I'm back again just with whatever's going up and down. Now, I don't know if, this is workshop material, but I hope you sort of got a sense. So every time, every other row here is hooking itself into the body of the work itself so that it stays attached. And that has just been a huge breakthrough for me. And I've used it in a lot of works. This piece of mine called Tapestry is the first time I used it. It was the first piece I made, Nicole, after I retired. And I was, I'm going to experiment now. And this first time I did it, I happened to discover something that I sometimes do. When you're going up and down and up, you don't have to keep it tight. You can have a little bit of this weft come down and really do some neat things. And so that's been very fun too, to sort of explore the dimensions of this. And this is a very recent piece. I just wanted to show you another possibility with this so-called hem idea or hem border idea. On this round piece, I attached it in exactly the same way I was describing, but instead of it staying flat, because the piece is round and there's just the physics of my knots pulling it in once it made the turn, all this is, I couldn't believe how well it worked. It's absolutely perpendicular to the wall, 2.5 inches out from the wall, all the way around. I mean, that's what I hoped for. Did I think it was going to happen? And then it did. So this is that same hem border with exactly the same catching of this purple weft, about 1 or 2 knots in. You can't do it on the first knot because then it pulls it down and you can see what's going on. So you have to let 1 knot stick out. And well, someday in a workshop, we can talk more, or you can. And then also a very common for me ending technique is a spiral endpoint. I made a couple of these small pieces. I have a total of 3. The first one I made many years ago that were made on inverted ceramic tea infusers. And it's when I was trying to have my tendons in my arm heal from injuries, and it was easier to work on. But as you can see here, it ends right there. And at the last knot, of course, I'm left with a bunch of warp hanging out there that I just made my last knot with. So what do I use? I take my needle nose plier, grab that loose warp, and with all my might, stick it in that hole. And it disappears for all time and looks perfect. And sometimes, as happened with this one, I think it pushed it in too much, the force of my use of the needle nose plier. But then before I pulled the pliers out, I tipped it a little bit and pulled back out. So I was able to repair the push-in damage. And this, again, even though a much different piece, is an example of ultimately ending. Here it was actually, I think, 3 knots. Usually I end up in sort of a very perfect circle. It sort of forces itself into a perfect circle. But this, because it started in such an oblong shape, sort of ended that way. And so there were 3 knots here, and I just, with my pliers, grabbing the end of each weft, one by one, just stuck them in behind for them to disappear. And a final example, this I actually have 3 pieces in Convergence this year, to my amazement. This piece, Hexapod, which is just purposely made at 15-inch dimensions, which is the limit for the small expression show. It is in that. And then I can't remember if tonight I'm going to show my lidded basket or not, but those of you who saw that last night or yesterday, that got into the basket show. And then 2 years ago, when Convergence didn't end up happening, except virtually in the magazine, 2 of my pieces were in, one of which I still have, Octopod, and they said they're going to invite those who got into the shows 2 years ago but couldn't show them to also be there. So that's why I'm going, because I have 3 pieces. And this again ends in a single knot at the end. So that's a very useful thing to have, both starting at a single point, and then of course you have to figure out, what am I going to do with what might end up being the circular end, or coming from the outside to the center. And then this is a name that I came up with, of course, called closing up the belly of the fish. And it came to me, I had never by necessity faced this situation, but in 2015 I made this fish, which is my absolute favorite of my pieces. And it started with this fin, and then right along here, I don't think I have a second. And then it grew on each side, because it has a complete other side too that looks pretty much just like this. And eventually I was here at the bottom. And imagine, if you can, I had from this side all the weft pieces hanging down, waiting for action. And on the other side I did. And so I had 2 sets of wefts and have to figure out some way to end them. Well, I don't actually, sadly, have a picture that shows you the closing up the belly of the fish, but you can imagine this being the belly of the fish, because in later pieces, I've really incorporated that as a major design feature, like I did here. In this piece, there were sort of 2 pieces I made. starting here at the top and going down. And then I also started at the bottom and went across and came up and worked it so that I was pretty much a straight line here and here. And I actually always had them connected. On each end, there actually was here cord, and that's on which I mounted with my lark's heads. So I had 12 or something lark's heads going this way and from the other side. And then I closed up the belly of the fish, and I did it because I had the same number of weft coming down here as I had weft coming up here. Every other one went in the other direction. That was the huge breakthrough. So I came up here with a warp, and I'm knotting on it. And then I, with my pliers, make it disappear behind. And I go to the next one here. And the one that was coming down here, I also push in and make disappear. Then I choose this weft, and it becomes my warp under here and disappears here, as does the green weft that was starting up. And I go here, and then I use this one. So every other one, I'm using the active one as the warp and totally ignoring the paired one. And then having this be the active one and ignoring this one. And you can't even, well, almost can't see it. Because every other one is holding it in. It's enough strength to make it look as if everything here was knotted, when in fact it's really every other one that's knotted, both in the top and the bottom. Now, I have no idea if that was understandable, but again, it's workshop material. And I just wanted to show you how, if I can say so, how sophisticated you can get with this idea, because this is part of Aboriginal Night, which I showed you a little while ago. And this is the technique I was just showing you of closing up the belly of the fish, because I had warp coming from this direction and I had warp coming from this direction. And I had to, make it work so that I could end it double-sided, if you will. But then, of course, you can do all sorts of bizarre and wonderful things with it and not do it every time. And so all these things were great breakthroughs for me. And as I mentioned yesterday, often when I had one of these breakthroughs, my next piece or a piece down the line was, at least for me, the maker in what I was getting out of it about exploring this new technique that I had discovered. So now a little bit of sort of, a lot of this is in a way easy stuff once you get into it, and very much what Cavendoli macramé is known for, the warp and weft changing and shifting that you can just do so easily. Now, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that not until this piece in 2007 did I really get my mind wrapped around something that was so obvious. And if I wasn't completely self-trained in every way, I would have probably known from almost day one. I had learned, but not right away, that I didn't have to cut my weft cords when I did the serious cut on the spool, for all time. In my early plant hangers, I figured out after experimentation how many feet long the cord had to be for my finished product. And I cut each cord once and started it and finished it, and it worked. But I got to a point where I realized, I actually can add it. It can end and I can add it. Then it wasn't until 2007, which was about 3 years or so into my modern age, as I described it yesterday, of really doing this stuff seriously, that I realized I can change the color. If I can change the weft, I don't have to stay in the same color. And here, these little fingers of color where the discovery happened. Such an obvious thing. And in a more recent piece, the bird bath, I just wanted to show you how it can be used with sophistication when I really, got into it. And so here I'm actually changing. This was white. It started here. You can see the lark's head, and it got up to here. And then using often my needle nose pliers, I made the white weft I was working on. I pushed it behind, and with a knot and my T-pin pinning it into the work I was already on from the back, because I didn't have a cork board there, I introduced the new color. And you really, I mean, it's sort of perfect. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm saying the technique is. It looks, like it just changed color. And so you can do that very nicely. For many years, when I was doing this, what I was really doing was making it get wider. I wasn't making one of the whites go away. I was just adding an additional chord, and it made things get wider. And on this piece where it gets wider here, I was only adding white. I made a decision to try to keep single strands always divided by a white chord in every case on the outside of the bird path. And just another example of chord changing. I'll go back because that was a little too fast on that. This piece actually won 3rd place in Houston in small expressions in 2016 or something, and was shipped out of town about 2 days before the hurricane hit. I might never have seen it again. But I wanted to show you this piece because this close-up here is illustrative of a lot of weft-changing life. And it was deep into it before I learned this. So this was building up, courses going all around this sculpture. And when I got here to this course, right in here, we'll use the example, every other brown, I inserted instead the yellow weft. And the next course, these disappeared the same way. So in 2 courses all around or back and forth, whatever the form is you're making, you can completely change weft color without any compromise of the integrity, because here, this is holding it down, even though this is not connected here. But this one is, this isn't, this is. And then when you get to the next course, this already is connected. And so it doesn't matter that this one isn't, because this one is again. So very quickly, you can do that change. Another way to change is just each course, you change one color. Well, I was going up. So I started here with all this sort of golden brown, introduced one yellow, and then because right here it was sort of going out in a V, I did one on each side. But you can see here in this diagonal, it's just each course, I added one new element of the new color. And to explain this curvaceous thing here, totally unexplained by me. I have no idea why that's there. It started manifesting itself. And I said, okay, I'm not going to fight this. We'll go there. Why it happened, I don't know. All the cord in this was 1 millimeter hemp, and some of it was 1 millimeter cotton on top of a 2 millimeter cotton warp. But even though it was all from the same company and all said to be 1 millimeter, by color, and I have found this to be true in all the cord I've bought from the same companies, they're different widths. And you don't know it to look at it, certainly. But when you've done 1,000 knots in a row and there's 2 colors beside each other, you detect these slight changes. And that's what made this happen. Something in this piece, things were not the same color. And this I wanted to show you here. This is another piece on one of the inverted ceramic tea infusers, but this is an example right here. This is growing up, where you can see I had a yellow warp and it suddenly manifested itself right there. And I switched the yellow right there from being the warp behind here into being the new weft. And these wefts became my warps. So that's the incredibly sharp change of color that you can do. And then this piece sold in Santa Fe on Canyon Road last year. And I don't think I finished saying when I was mentioning this to the group yesterday, 2 days ago, yesterday, that then 5 months passed and nothing else sold, and they kicked me out. But I had the great fun of the one sale, and this was the piece that sold. I sort of thought it might, as did the gallery people, because of the Southwestern this and that, which is of course very popular for us there. But what I wanted to show you here was probably the most sophisticated warp weft changing I've ever done. So I was coming, this was the background here and here all the way, and this was really just a hole developing as I came forward here, and all this warp was sticking in, and ultimately I had this sort of open triangle. And then all along here, everywhere the diagonal hits, this is what had been warp here, emerging now as weft. And the thing that made it so sophisticated, in addition to the diamond shape and so on, was that I had to, as I was approaching, change all the warp color, because it all had been this. That was my warp. But as I was approaching here and knowing that the warp was about to become weft, I had to do a relatively simple process of introducing behind the existing warp the new warp. And then if you let it, with every knot you do, it twists a little bit. So that often in 3 double half hitches, the warp that had been on the bottom is now on the top. And on the next knot, you can make the old warp, pull it down with your needle nose plier, and then just start knotting the next time on the single remaining warp. So I can look very closely and see a little bit up here of lumpiness. And I know that's exactly where the new warp was twisting over, and I had double warp for a few moments there. So now some bulges being made from an increased chord density. And this is a piece I showed yesterday and mentioned quickly this aspect about it. And I'll bring you to this close-up. And this was a way I discovered that as I was doing it, of bringing a whole bunch of chord from the left here of the piece way over to the right by twisting it and then pinning it down with knots intermittently. But then when it emerged, it had way too much. I mean, there was enough space here for probably, 3 or something knots, but I used about 5 of them. And then the next course, I used 7 or 8 of them, and could really expand with all that newfound weft that was just waiting to be exposed. And you'll see, particularly with jute, the chord is so forgiving often. And definitely with jute, it just sort of absorbs and hides anything that isn't perfect and makes it look better than probably it is. So another way to make sculptural forms is bulges that are caused by putting side-by-side chords of different density. And probably the best example of it is sort of right in this area here, the green there. Because there's some real differences in chord size. And had that not been so here, I did it intentionally, this would have really been just like sort of a perfect pipe or glass shape. Wouldn't have had any of these indentations, which were only a creation of having 1 millimeter right beside 2 millimeter in a bunch of cases. And it just causes, warping. If you force the knots to be tight, but suddenly they have half the size of chord making the knot, it really creates all sorts of amazing bulges. And then you can have curves. I've showed you this one before, and this really, these sorts of curvaceous forms really allow you to do amazing things because of this concept of the concave and the convex. Right here on this turn, you'll notice if you look sort of real carefully here, the next row is longer. And this course, just even the amount I'm showing you, I mean, as you go up here, what started as just a few, in order to keep this flat, you have to keep adding chord at a great rate. I mean, if you wanted to be perfectly flat here, this has a certain amount of rise to it. You'd have to be adding probably a new chord after almost every knot to keep it wide enough, enough fabric or enough fiber there to fill the opening. But on these types of turns, the opposite is true. If you didn't every time you went around, because look, it's actually getting smaller and smaller and smaller, you have to remove or drop the chord, make it disappear behind, and have fewer knots every time. or it's just going to go straight up like a wall. So you have tremendous control about how quickly you make this curve happen here that flattens the piece out. And that really gives you power in the design and the creation and addressing, whatever comes up. So another way, and I'll just do this one quickly, I can't even begin to tell you, it's definitely workshop material, how to create these cubes, but the cubes themselves, the design itself forces the three-dimensionality and the sculptural nature of this. And I wanted to show you too, while I was on this, because you can change weft color, you can make things spotted. If you want to, you just change it and then change it. This is actually two different colors. In real life, you can barely tell it, and you really can't in the image. I wish I hadn't gotten all the trouble of doing this in two just slightly different shades, but it's a very interesting thing you can do by the ease and sort of perfectness with which you can change weft. And then almost done here with the sculptural forms is this rule of the pipe, rule of the straw, as I call it. And I've actually alluded to this a bunch of times just now. If you don't add or delete chord, you end up with things like this, which are just straws or pipes. So every time I went around here, I didn't add or subtract, and it just forced it straight up. And then right here, I deleted like crazy. I bet every time I made a knot, I dropped a knot behind it and went to the next one, and it really made it make that turn and flatten right out at the end. So with that skill, you can do any sort of orbs you want to. It's really only that exact same concept of these all started at the bottom. No, actually not. They started at the top. And then I added and added and added, and then stopped adding, and even dropped a couple, and then added and added, and then you end up thinning out at the bottom. So, and then these end sort of in the spiral stop point that I was mentioning. So a couple of final thoughts. Some of these I've already mentioned in passing, but position yourself directly in front of the knot you're creating if you want to make a perfect knot. I'm moving my board all the time and my chair all the time, usually my board, because I've seen what happens if you don't. And then you'll learn only with experience to position the T-pin most effectively. If you put the pin in usually just exactly perpendicular, when you pull on the cord, more than likely it's going to pull the T-pin over or have some give. But if you put it in at not as much as a 45-degree angle against the direction that the cord's going to pull, you keep it in exactly the spot you pinned it down. And of course, if you make the mistake of doing the angle in the other way, the cord will just slip right up to the top of the T-pin. Tighten that knot every time. Say it over and over in your brain until it happens without your thinking. And then this is something I'm telling you guys because, well, many of you have probably learned the same lesson, but I didn't in time. Listen to your hands, give them a rest. Do not for 6 hours with barely a pee stop in between. You must not do that. And be patient with this. I mean, you'll notice my pieces, I mentioned this yesterday, most of them take about 2.5 months. That's when I was working 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. And when you start like the beginning of some new band of color, I mean, it takes days and days for it to really manifest itself in the design. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that with weaving. So you really just have to trust and be patient. And then I find in all my pieces, I have to constantly be looking at the trend, and these are trends that the knots are doing, the cord's doing, not what I had in mind. And you have to see it happen as soon as it starts, and then decide, as I often do, okay, I've just been instructed by the cord and a design redo is happening right now, or you quash it right away, and you learn over time ways to fight, the bad stuff that's happening. And then finally, and I want to, before I say these words, I want to tell you, almost from the very beginning, and I have no explanation for this, I've had amazing confidence in the knots doing it. And I've only once ever had to stop a project and throw the thing out and, unknot it and forget it. Almost every time it has worked. And I've learned to have faith in the power of the knots I'm working on. They are almost always seem to want to teach me something and show me how to do it. And they often on their own end up bringing me to really magnificent conclusions and things that I just hadn't thought was going to happen. So I commend the knots to you, and I really thank you for your attention.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Al.
Thanks.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I've been, like we've mentioned, that I've been able to see your work a lot, and I just had, I knew, because we've talked about it, about the amount of work that goes into it, but I had no idea quite the process of how things came together. So it's really fascinating to get a more in-depth education on how you created these pieces. Oh my goodness.
And since you're going to give the tour, I'm glad you know.
Yeah, I know, right? Looks like we have a question from Jane, who says, is there any place for this technique in finishing woven rugs?
Well, there must be. That's really where all this began, was decorative knot tying of fringes at the bottom of various sorts of textiles. So surely, and it might be the more traditional sort of open weave, if you will, of macrame that ends up with sort of diamonds of open space between the knots, because that is more that than the Cavendoli sort of tapestry style that I do. Is what was used for fringe endings. But I bet you could just Google, macrame or knot end rug, and you'd probably see all sorts of examples of how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And let's see, Rebecca C says, I learned so much. Thank you for being so candid and open on your process. I echo that it's just been really neat to see just how your thought process, probably like just getting to see an up close vision of where you were working at what point. Yeah, I think that I don't know what else to say. It's just a really fascinating process. Babs wonders, how long are chords when you end and stuff into your piece with your needle nose?
So I must say I've gotten really good at this, and often have very little waste. Or if I made a change in design, I might have a whole bunch of long pieces that I cut up and then use another time, of course. But what I learned, I've never actually read this anywhere, but it's an important thing to know. For me, almost consistently with whatever sort of cord I use, the ratio is 1 to 7. And that's to say, if I was to have a 7-inch finished project, 7-inch finished product, I'd have to cut 49 inches plus a few of cord for that product, because 7 inches, it's something like 7 times is used in each of the double half hitches. Amazing amount of cord. And I almost always, as I mentioned, buy my cord online now. They usually come, but not always, in 100-meter spools, occasionally 100-yard spools, and sometimes 200-meter spools. And what I almost always do for pieces roughly the sizes that you see of my pieces is because now I just am totally unconcerned, absolutely, about being sure I cut things long enough, because with very rare exceptions, anything that I need to add a new cord to, I just can, and no one but me, and even I will never know where I did it once it's done from the front. Anyway,
it looks so seamless. It's just incredible.
But what I do usually when I'm starting pieces is I have pretty long arms, and I grab it and I do 3 or 4, which ends up being about that many meters. And then because if it's mounting, I'm talking about, which it often is, it's going to be the lark's head, I double that if I want each of the chords to still be that long. And then if a chord runs out or breaks or something, then of course I'm not doing the doubling idea.
Well, it looks like Babs' follow-up question is, so the part that you're putting into the piece to finish it, how much of that length gets stuffed? Like 1 inch, 3 inches? Or?
Well, I mean, you mean at the start of the piece? If it's at
I think at the end of the piece.
I mean, it's whatever's left.
And it'll just go.
Yeah, whatever's left, I just push in the back. And if I've been, that's when I was saying how clever I am. Sometimes I'm saying, look at that, an inch is left. I used everything.
Yarn chicken.
Much more is left. And then when I'm done, it sometimes takes me 3 hours, 4 hours, literally. I turn it over and with my little scissors, with sessions as long as I can handle, I cut every one of those little burrs that are in the back and the ones that are long enough, which for me means about a foot, 10 inches or more, I save. And it's amazing how often I end up using them. And even when there's a little bit, because now that I know how to do little dots of color, I mean, whoa, every color I have, I want.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's see. Penny says the interaction between the technique and the art is really fascinating. Thanks for telling us all about it. And Janet says, I have to go off to another meeting, but this was so wonderful. I did look around for linen cord, which you mentioned yesterday, and found some. I found that 2mm linen cord is available on Etsy in a bunch of colors. It all seems to come from Lithuania, though. So that cord itself isn't too expensive, but the shipping is more than the cord on small orders. However, you might get a better deal if you ordered larger quantities. Jane says, do you have any photos of a work in progress?
I've never done that. I don't. I have a big piece here that I'm working on, but is it so awful when the computer gets moved? Oh. Should I not do that just because of the...
Oh.
Should I give it a try? Okay.
Yeah, but I think so. Okay, I would not say no.
I'll give it a try and we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
I don't think there's any way to show it all.
Wow.
This border here, the bottom half is done. This is that hem border ending that I was talking about with you. And I'll slowly go up here. This is a combination of 1mm and 2mm, almost all on 2mm warp. I don't know if I'm going to go close on one of these. And can you see the little indented areas?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, there they are. They're there. Those are all done with 1mm on 1mm.
Okay.
And are recessed.
That is so.
And then I'm actually I work on it upside down, but it's being displayed here correctly. This is the top part. And then there's all that weft. And I'm going to actually bring it down on the board. Well, I can't show you on the computer, but there's a few more inches to bring it down on the board. So this will probably end up being right up to the 36-inch height.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing. Is that going to be that? So that's going to be a flat piece for mounting on the wall?
Well, it's going to be.
Or I mean, not flat, but.
Right, because it probably, even right now, and maybe it's as most as it will be, I bet it has 4 to 5 inches of depth.
Okay.
And that piece is being called Aspen Stand.
Oh, love it.
I'm happy with it. Though I had to put it aside for 6 weeks a month ago because of my hand problems. And now I'm back to working on it every day, and it's so fun.
Oh, good. Well, Selena was wondering, do you work from bottom to top, or did you say you have it reversed right now, or?
I mean, you always have to work on it coming towards you, because if you will, it always grows down.
Mm-hmm.
This piece, because I was consciously trying to save my back, the area you saw in the middle, I won't move my computer again, is where I started actually, sort of in the center of the piece. So I could hold my corkboard in front of me, not have to bend over it very hard, and work toward me. And now when I finished the bottom half, I was wonderfully able to flip the thing and start again. In pieces like the one behind me here, the octopod, where I start on the outside, I'll try to say this and hope you understand me. It took me ages to conceptualize what was happening when I first started these pieces. I can't, when I have this on the board, work on the area that's closest to me. In fact, I have to lean over the entire board and work on the opposite furthest end in order to have what I want to be the outside of the knot grow up.
Oh.
I don't know if you could conceptualize that, but when, I can't point to that. It always wants to grow down. So you have to literally lean over it and have the knot be what you can barely see in order for it to grow up. So those are back breakers, but I have a lot of those works and I have a lot of back broken stuff as a result of it.
Oh my gosh. Well, so do you start with a really strong idea of what you want to create, or do you let it kind of work itself? Like how do you work with like inspiration and like concept?
Well, I mentioned yesterday, and I'll re-say ever so quickly, most of the time, maybe 80 or more % of the time, when I'm in the last weeks of whatever project I'm on, or the last 25% or something, I just start ruminating about what's happening next. And sometimes, as I've mentioned, it grows out of some new technique,
Right.
thing, and maybe not. And so often by the end of the piece that I'm working on, I have a really good visual view. And then maybe again, about 25% or less maybe of the time, I end up drawing it. Sometimes really to scale, if it's like a geometric piece, and really I have to know 5 inches in from the left, right. So sometimes that much. On the rainbow trout, I went online and I printed out pictures of trouts, and I really figured out exactly how far back on the back the dorsal fin starts. So there's been that extreme. As I mentioned today, I always, I think, really have a good, at least visual understanding of my beginning and ending.
Okay.
And then sometimes I've gone as far as really only knowing the beginning and ending, and then really just let it happen on the board. Though that's probably rarer than having a very clear picture of the whole thing, but mostly just in my head.
Okay.
But I must say, on any of my pieces, if you look, at any given place, especially a complex place, I did not figure that out in advance. That happened there. And that's what's so exciting about it. Even in my very highly planned out pieces, there's constant excitement and things, oh God, I have to do something here. And then wonderfully, so far, always have been able to.
They're just incredible. Mary was wondering, do you have formal training in color theory?
I do not at all. I must say I'm married to a 2D artist.
Okay.
Who really does a lot of color. So for, decades and decades and decades and decades, I've been, absorbing the vibes, but I have no training in art, period.
Could have fooled us, Al.
Not myself.
Selena was also wondering, how do you make the spindles in the middle at the starting area?
Of the one I showed, I bet she means right here. Yeah, that's a technique that various of my pieces have. If you look on my website, you'll see several that use it a lot. It's called wrapping. Which I bet many of you know. I mean, it's not a sophisticated term. And I have usually, like I did in this piece, maybe 12 of the chords going up and down. And then right in the middle on this one, I did my wrapping. So the middle is heavily wrapped. And then I have all of this, as I showed you in the rusty tullet where I had the density of cord suddenly appear. At the top of each of those wraps, there's suddenly loads of cord, but I was able to do sort of a V-shaped growing thing out of it by using only some of them the first time and then adding some more, and it's all happening in the back. So you don't see any of that going on, which is so easy and nice.
Yeah. Well, so you showed us the back yesterday, and I was wondering if maybe you could also show it the back of a piece today.
I'll do the same one since it's the handy one.
Yeah.
This is bandwidth that you saw. And then here's
Awesome.
the back. And it's cutting like in here. This is the thing that takes hours and hours to cut all those ends. And then I've always let show where I've taken a piece of a color and then borrowed that cord and then used it elsewhere. It's very nice rather than having to always introduce new cords. If you can borrow, one of the ones that I had punched through from the front because I didn't need it there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I often do that, and it adds some strength to the piece. And I've often gotten in, when I was new at this, I didn't even think at the beginning about how to hang these pieces. It never even crossed my mind. Then I went through a period of time where I really designed the hanging into it, and cords that were, part of the piece, I would, very conscientiously leave in the back. It was so difficult because my pieces are not, perfectly symmetrical ever. And so to know where the weight was going to be and so on. And then often it pulled the pieces out of shape, So for a long time now, what I've done is buy dowels of wood, and in various ways, even sometimes just really sewing a couple of sews with less than 1 millimeter waxed linen, and then attaching the hanging cord.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually worked very well, and the dowel has given a little bit of
Like extra
solidity and stability to the piece. But as you can see too, I never use infrastructure of any sort at any point. It's just, pinned in or on the board. But the power of the knot, this curve here, these are never going anywhere. Once all these knots are there, this is the shape forever, and it's hard, it's not, so it's not really good for clothing or dolls to hug and stuff, because it's sort of rough stuff. Even when you try to use soft things, it ends up being quite hard. And I must say, I've tried in the early days and completely gave up on yarn or anything like yarn, because it's just too supple, and you don't see the knot. All the exquisiteness of the knotting just disappears in the knot itself because of the softness. So I almost, my major thing that I use, bandwidth, that I just held up, is almost exclusively cotton. Mm-hmm. And in many of my pieces, certainly if they're big ones, it's 2 millimeter cotton, sometimes slightly waxed cotton that I use. And then all ranges of the world of rat tail, as it used to, and sometimes is still called, rayon, polyester, nylon, increasingly those things. I used to use linen, as someone responded to today, and I have had a hard time finding 2 millimeter linen, but it must be out there. And there's jute, and all these things, the jutes, the cottons, you just can't imagine the extensive variety of what the cord is actually when you have it in your hand. It can be so different and be called 2 millimeter cotton or whatever it is. It's just, you folks probably know about that. And that's always fun and always a challenge, because, as I said, even from the same company, the same size, it isn't. They just aren't. And it really affects as you make hundreds and hundreds of knots.
Yeah, I'm sure the varied materials probably affect your hands differently as well. Do they?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, some are almost sweet on the hand. At least you think at first.
Uh-huh.
Hours later, you realize, oh
Like,
my God. And some of them, I mean, the first nod, you realize, whoa, this is rough stuff.
Yeah.
And I sometimes purposely use some very rough stuff, usually, because the effect is so different. And if you have it right beside beautiful cotton or one of these rat tails, I mean, the shocking difference of the quality of the fiber is very impressive and can be, of course, part of the design.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Kate is wondering, do you do your own dyeing? Do you dye your own cord?
When I first joined so many years ago to the Northern Colorado Weavers Guild, the first day, some people, as I know many of you are, who raise the goats and, and do them. And I said, no, I don't. I have always bought my cord. Yeah, I sometimes in the old days when hobby shops were going out of business, as I mentioned yesterday, now extensively online, but I'm also, my wife and I are aficionados of secondhand stores, and it's rare, but I have sometimes made some killings and found like, wow, look at that cord, that I can't even find type of cord.
Right. Yeah, that they don't make anymore, maybe.
Probably so.
Well, that's great. Let's see. I think we've gone through most of the questions. Does anyone else have a question? Feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask Al directly if you'd like. Are there any other questions? That might be
the bewitching hour.
I know, that might be it for our questions. Oh, my cat's deciding to come in. Well, Al, thank you so much for sharing your work and your process with us today. Just really remarkable and different than anything that we've had in years. So thank you very much for sharing. And it's just such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a complete joy. I have to tell you, it ain't hard to talk about your own work.
Well, we enjoy hearing about it. So thank you so much.